So, I'm going to take some questions, and there'll be long-winded answers, and then we're going to sing some more. So questions.
Are you gonna make us get up?
We will, because we'll just keep going. Questions?
This is like kind of broad, and that's okay. So, just in terms of contemporary action that's happening, could you just speak to what your opinion is of communities that exist online and communities that exist that are a lot more tangible and personal, and if you have an opinion on the role that the internet adds to contemporary activism?
So what is the role in contemporary movements? What is the role of the internet, as well as what is and those communities that are associated primarily that live online versus those communities that are more grounded or have more communal aspects? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and physical, right? Well, one, nothing beats labor-intensive, low-technology organizing. Nothing. That part of to understand the internet, particularly Twitter, is as features of the market. Right? Much like music is a feature of the market. It is a tool that can be exacted in such a way that it can have both positive, negative, and in most instances, contradictory ramifications. And so the internet as a feature of the market, in terms of a feature of the market, meaning that capitalism will commodify anything. Right? That's the nature of capitalism. So you probably figured out I'm a democratic socialist. Not the Bernie Sanders kind. And that is not, I don't endorse candidates, I prophesy to them. And so part of our struggle, right, has to do with what are the ways in which social media, particularly Twitter, can function as a guide and a service to social movements, the same way fax machines and walkie-talkies and two-way radios played in the civil rights movement. That's one way to think of social media as a tool. The problem in a televisual culture that is preoccupied with celebrity, meaning so Twitter followers become a replacement for on-the-ground organizing, which is a feature of neoliberalism, because Twitter followers are predicated on individual relationships, not organizational aptitude. And so social media has played a particular way. For instance, in Ferguson, the police be on TV line. First of all, the news would literally be reading their press releases like they were the news. Like, we had a great staff, so our staff would get copies of the police's press release. And so CNN would be literally reading the press release as though it is the news. And then they say they didn't tear gas us. And I'd be literally washing tear gas off of me. And so we did not use tear gas tonight. So somebody would tweet a picture of the tear gas canister to CNN. CNN would get it, producer get into the ear of the reporter live and said, well, actually there's a picture. Can we get that up on the screen? Of a tear gas canister. And then the police have to stop lying for that instance. Right? So in that sense, social media can also direct people to places and provide information and signal a variety of ideas to large groups of people. So in that sense, it's in service to media. The problem is that when folks come to think that social media presence is the same thing as on-the-ground organizing. So I'm not an activist, I'm an organizer. I'm accountable to a base of people. Right? I'm accountable to their names I know. They're people I'm responsible to as an organizer that has political objectives and goals. For me, it is usually around state targets. Department of Justice, do your job. as a way to create political space. This is straight out of Lenin, where you ignore the backward sectors of society and you go for the reformist sector. So Twitter can play a role to get little old ladies in the middle of the country to come to understand that there's some possibilities that there might be a higher level of police brutality upon black bodies in America. And so Twitter can play that role. But it does not replace low technology and labor-intensive organizing. And what is unique about this particular historical moment is that there is at times that it becomes a tool in service of the media, but it also it becomes a tool in service of struggle, but also it becomes a tool in service to for certain forms of individual adulation and the creation of certain kinds of celebrity. So yes, and so both and, but we have to caution against it, right? It's like, yeah, yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry I walk in and out because I am serving tonight, but you talk about how music is a form of communicating. It's the form of talking about the truth, and you just spoke about how the media plays a role in and out depending on the individual. But on a singular basis, not being involved on a larger scale, without using voice, without using song as means, but just witnessing, there's a step further than witnessing, and it's actually doing something. Because I think that a problem that we find is that, you'll witness a form of racism, and then there's the action behind it, like what do you do within that moment? And it becomes an individual Samaritan, like part of the Samaritan law, our duty, am I not right? To speak out in that moment and not necessarily condemn somebody for having said something ignorant or stupid, but to challenge their thought and to re-educate them, because it's a form of education. Racism is not innate, it is taught.
Well, so for me, the question is that I think there's a certain enlightenment sensibilities that I want to caution. That part of the enlightenment was the belief that right ideas would lead to right behavior and the inevitability of human progress. And then Hitler pops out. Right? Germans, Professor, you would know, Germany dominated the philosophical mind for 800 years.
Something like that.
And then Hitler pops out. So right ideas don't lead to right action. Secondly, the question before us, I think, as a democratic civilization, individual choices are important and are good, right?
Right.
But my obsession is a lot around the same obsession that emerges in Christianity, particularly among Black Pentecostals, the obsession with personal piety, which is about individual behavior. I'm concerned about social piety. What are the ways in which a society is structuring itself that it cares for the most vulnerable members of its civilization? And so even within the framework, actually in the context of a democratic civilization in terms of protected speech, one cannot lose track of the realities of speech versus systems. That oftentimes the protected speech only reinforces the pre-existing systems. Now, so you can say racist stuff to black people because there's an entire system that reinforces it. Right? The images that you see on TV, police shooting them down all the time. And I think also part of what it has to do with the ways in which we collectively resist. We read it. The ways in which we collectively resist has to do with the doing and sufferings of everyday people. Particularly in Ferguson, for instance, there was no nonprofit industrial complex. So what you had primarily was individuals who came together, organized, and pressed over and against a militarized state apparatus that caused the nation to pause. So that's not, so if you just got me out there by myself, that's one thing. But if you got masses of people bringing passion to bear upon a system, this is even why we're having this conversation. So what are the ways in which we are engaging in, good God Almighty. Did these folks actually go here? Did y'all ship them in? Might be early in the morning, might be early in the morning, might be early in the morning, might be early in the morning. Might be late in the midnight hour, might be late in the midnight hour, might be late in the midnight hour, might be late in the midnight hour. Might be late in the midnight hour. Late in the midnight hour. Might be late in the midnight hour. Hey! My grandmama said, you don't believe that meat is crazy, but you gon' learn today. She say what goes around comes around, and you reap what you sow. She said everything that glitter and gold, no more water, fire next time. But we don't get no justice, you don't get no peace of mind. We ready, we coming. I'ma say it one more time. No more water, fire next time. But we don't get no justice, you don't get no peace of mind. We ready. going. Say it one more time. I believe. I believe. We going. We going. It's our duty to fight for our freedom. It's our duty to it. Hey, we must love and support each other. We have nothing to lose. I believe, I believe, I believe, I
an entire family suffers, an entire community. So today violence, we see institutionalized violence more and more, but violence as a political movement of the people, throw Molotov cocktails, throw rocks. Is that still something that's valuable, or has it completely lost its meaning and become just another form of secular?
Well, I think that, so it's the question of, so we have to begin with the understanding that the state is violent. That the very structure of the nation state, the drawing of the borders required violence. Right? That's just the nature of the nation state. And so the state is violence, and those, we've trained about 5,000 around the country in militant nonviolent civil disobedience. And we do so with a predicated assumption that the state is going to be violent, and those of us who do nonviolent resistance depend upon the violence of the state. Right? We depend on the state to show its ass. Right? So that there was a certain political power of images of riot police lined up over and against clergy in their robes. Because that's about appealing to that middle. Right? So that's when it sees, it just made me think. So I'm from, in Arkansas, where I'm from, the paper for the state is the Arkansas Democratic Gazette, right? You know, little old country paper. And I was on the cover of it. Right? And now mind you, I was actually on the cover of the New York Times at the same time. My family called me and they said, "Boy, you done made it. You're on the cover of the Arkansas Democratic Gazette." But part of that is, right, what are the ways in which nonviolent resistance appealed to the conscience of the nation? The question before us is whether or not the nation has a conscience, and the jury's still out. Right? And so the dichotomy between violence and nonviolence, I want to problematize, because nonviolent resistance depends on state violence. And then I think a more direct point to your question, you know, it's interesting. There's a book called Why Nonviolence Works that looked at, I think maybe 48 or 72 nonviolent resistance around the country. Right, around the world. And what's interesting to me, like one of their main examples was South Africa. But in South Africa, where you did have a free and democratic election, apartheid is land. That's what creates apartheid. You take 87% of the people and you put them on 13% of the land, and you put 13% of the people on 80% of the land. And until there's a redistribution of the land question, what you fundamentally have is the death of armed resistance, which is replaced with a certain form of polite politic that does not account for the high levels of poverty related to questions of land. And so there is violence intrinsic in the construction as relates to who has access to the land. So violence is at work even though there's no violent resistance. So violence is always present in that context. As it relates to people making a decision to do armed resistance. So when I was in Palestine, I threw rocks at the wall.
I'm from there, I also threw
Right. So I threw rocks at the wall. I mean, you're just sitting there looking at this daggum wall. Right, and so before I knew it, I picked up and I just threw a stone at the wall. So for some of the older civil rights veterans who were on the delegation, they thought stone throwing was violent, even at the wall. Right. But kids throwing stones at tanks and tear gas, that part of what we have to acknowledge in a discourse about violence is the asymmetry of power, which is an ethical consideration. Right? So, how tall are you? Stand up. So, if he haul off and slap me, don't. I'm old. get up to something. Right? If he hauls off and slap me, and I kick him in his shin, we both hit each other, but is there a difference in power? There's a difference in power by virtue of size, right? Also him being in a white male body, right? There's a whole set of pre-dialogical assumptions as it relates to questions of power and his ability to do violence without certain implications that I don't have. So I hit him back and they call the police, who going to jail? Right? These are just the realities. So I'm saying that, thank you, baby. Is that so what I'm saying is that I want to keep track of questions of asymmetry of power and questions of the ways in which violence is enacted and who's enacting power. Now I'm going to answer your question. Back to that book about these stories of nonviolence, looking at, say, apartheid or the United States. We had a nonviolent resistance in the United States. And we still have, close to 40% of black babies living in poverty. And some would call that a success. I call that a failure. Success by virtue of the fact that every 4 years we have a dog and pony show. Right? Like we got the most recalcitrant and like even in terms of kind of bourgeois political analysis, Trump is just not fit for public discourse. He's just not fit for it. Right? So if I was just a diehard, this is a great system, we don't need to do just a little tinkering with it. Trump is not fit for the political discourse, who is exacting violence. You see with his rhetoric, with the increase of his rhetoric, you see more violence and attack on Muslim brothers and sisters, folks who they think, Americans don't. If you're a Sikh, it don't matter. You just get, you look too brown, right? That's America. And so in that instance, so that kind of violence. I, in the comfort of the United States, where I have the illusion of constitutional restraints. Right? Now, in Ferguson, oftentimes, we'd be like, they're not going to do that. And they always did. Curfew at midnight, they start tear gassing at 8:45. But there is some constitutional restraint. Department of Justice coming in, bad images, piss off little old ladies in the Midwest and in the South. You see what I'm saying? And they don't do that to them, right? So part of what we're dealing with in the context of the United States has to do with constitutional restraints. Palestine's a different context, where there is no illusion of constitutional restraints. And that there's a very powerful asymmetry, there's a very distinctive asymmetry in power. In South Africa, no constitution, the things just went on with the miners. Black government oppressing miners. The miners were trying to unionize, right? Violence. And so in those contexts, I am not sure what my position would be. I do know is that I don't want to be them. I don't want to tear gas children. I don't want to violate people's civil rights. I don't want to violate their human rights. I know I don't want to be them. And I have a suspicion, given the way in which we already articulated the nation state is intrinsically tied to violence, that the reaction of violence, that it is too easy to become like them. And I don't want to be like them. And so it's not for me, in the comfort of the United States, with the relative privilege of an American passport, to go to Palestine and tell people not to do violence when I'm not facing what they're facing. I won't do it because I don't want to become them. And I think the very possibility of engaging in violence makes us like them. And so so I'm being sweetened on your question. I'm not answering.
I get what you're saying.
Right.
Not unethical violence, but.
And then there are way greater philosophers have wrestled with this question. Fanon in this text where he talks about revolutionary violence. Like there is a discourse around it that I think is a significant discourse. I'm just saying, I want to make the nonviolent option. But nonviolence is not necessarily rendered as a form of pacifism, but it's about a direct confrontation with the state. So we confront police. Right? And so in that confronting of the peace and a confronting and a direct engagement with the state, trying to force the moral drama. So it's not just sitting down somewhere. You see what I'm saying? You got a question?
Yeah. Given everything that you said tonight, which was really amazing, what do you think it means to be courageous? And I ask you this because I'm thinking about the various ways in which individuals define courage, right? And what that means. It's courageous for some people to put on a uniform.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, well, for instance, if it's
it's courageous to go against a person in a uniform.
well, I think so. I want to reject the neutrality of the phrase. I want to argue that courage, that the only possibility of courage is in the face of overwhelming state violence. I want to reserve the discourse for courage, be outside of individual acts of heroics and situated within the social landscape of the political terrain in the context of the nation state. So a discourse for me about courage is, to me, an honest discourse about courage only happens in that context. So it's one thing to say, I'm courageous because I'm a soldier, but if I'm part of the most powerful army in human history, it's very different, it's like saying Goliath is courageous versus David. Right? But it takes a certain amount of whatever it takes to be there. But David's courage is a different kind of courage than Goliath's. Right? So I'm looking for, so I want to posit philosophically that a discourse, an ethical discourse about courage begins only when courage is being displayed by those who are in the face of overwhelming power and violence. Courage also is not the absence of fear, it is the capacity to overcome it. So I am scared out of my mind most of the time I'm on the streets in front of you. But something happens collectively when we do that work together, right? So I'm trying to push away from individual acts of courage, right? So Durkheim talks about the notion of collective effervescence. Something happens to us when we're in the street together. It'd be 10,000 and it'd feel like 100,000. And so I want to talk about courage in that context. The ways in which those who are historically othered or find themselves in the face of overwhelming forms of violence are able to resist and muster up enough capacity to resist. Hell no. Right? You did? Go. So, yeah, we're going to take one more and we got to be done in 4 minutes.
Back here?
Okay, I'm sorry, baby. Go ahead. And then, all right, let me get someone who hasn't had one. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Reverend Sekou, for coming to our house.
You stand up.
I think I can speak on everybody's behalf and say that we're more than grateful for you coming to
Can you speak up?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so
Repeat the question, don't worry, we'll repeat the question.
So you mentioned the idea of moral bankruptcy, and if we look in terms of how the state is formed and the ideas of how we decided to implement our laws, it seems, if we go back into the history, it seems that we were always searching for acquisitions of power or material gains, and our laws weren't based off of principles like equality and freedom. We used our power to exploit and to preserve our self-interest. So I'm thinking that the way to bring awareness to achieve solidarity, we need awareness. So I'm just thinking of at this point where if we do come to the point where we do have individuals that are aware and we begin to unify, what does this next stage look like where some of these the racist ideology and nation state, it's like reform. Like, what is this next stage?
I have no idea. But I know, what I do know is that they're going to continue to kill us and we're going to continue to resist. And that part of the possibility, or the question is, what does the next phase look like once people have achieved awareness and we built some level of solidarity, given the fact that our legal system and our laws are often about the exacting of power on bodies versus virtues such as equality and justice. Is that right? And so within the framework, so for me, our task, the task before us is, what are the ways in which we muster up the courage to rebel, and that in that act itself. So I don't believe that it's a linear process. That something happens over time and space when we're consistent in doing the work. And it doesn't take a lot of people. So you know, what's that one, them boys down in Greensboro, you remember the sit-in? You know, none of them had been trained. In Nashville, they've been training for 6 months on nonviolent resistance. But in Greensboro, they were just like, we just gonna go sit in there. No training. That was making the courage to rebel and making a conscious decision to engage in resistance against segregation. Right? And then the training came. And so I'm not a vanguardist. Right? I don't believe a particular class of people who have released a particular certain of education are going to be the ones to free us, because if that was the case, we would have never produced Fannie Lou Hamer. Right? You don't get Fannie Lou Hamer, this sharecropper, struggling, who doesn't have all the sophisticated language that relates to the course of the Democratic project. She just knows it's wrong that she can't vote. So that, you see what I'm saying? So I don't know who that is, and I don't know what the next one. We couldn't predict it, Ferguson. We just don't know. Part of it is that for those of y'all in the context of a liberal institution, is that how are you preparing yourself to be ready? Because your time will come. All right, we're gonna do a quick, short one for you, and then we're gonna close out together. Come on. He wanted to send me overseas to fight in a war I didn't start with some folk that look like me. Hell no, I won't go. You can lock me up and throw away the key. Hell no, 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 hell no. Sending the army to bring about peace, but we all know war is a racket, and it's all about hell no, I won't go. You can lock me up and throw away the key. Hell no, and I won't go. Put me in jail and I'll still be free. Hell no, hell no, hell no, hell no, hell no. So we're gonna get ready to get on out of here. So we're gonna do one for you. We'll surprise you with it. And it's fun. And I think it ends on the right kind of rhythm. Sanctified. Let's go. We gotta stand up. Alright, we gotta stand up. They wanna grab somebody to dance with. Sanctified. The way she walk make me wanna speak in tongues. She's so holy. Make me believe in God even if there wasn't one. She's so saved. She make me wanna go to church. She's so righteous. Her water is the only thing I thirst. So sanctified. Yes, she is. She is so sanctified. Yes, she is. She is so sanctified. Yes, she is. She is so sanctified. Hallelujah. Yeah. So sanctified. I can feel her wherever I'm at. She's so holy. She wrote the Bible with a sweat. She's so saved. She can give recovery of sight to the blind. So righteous. In a blink of an eye, she could free Palestine. So sanctified. Yes, she is. She is so sanctified. Yes, she is. She is so sanctified. Yes, she is. She is so sanctified. Hallelujah. Yeah. She's fire baptized and Holy Ghost filled. She's fire baptized and Holy Ghost filled. She's fire baptized and Holy filled. She's fire baptized and she's Holy Ghost filled. She's fire baptized. Filled with the Holy Ghost. Sanctified. 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 Filled with the Holy Ghost. Sanctified.